clarify, disagree, pose a question, you just put your hand up, point of information, and speakers can choose whether or not they want to accept. We now move on to our second proposition speaker, Rizah Khan. Rizah is a first-year lawyer at Downing College, a very fine college. Rizah won the right to speak via open audition. Rizah, you have the ears of the House.
Hello. Hello and good evening, everyone. It is an honor to be here. Now, as my opening proposition speaker colleague spoke about the UK as an American, I'm going to speak about America as a British person. So, the fight for equality is one for which we all struggle. Whether it's a grand fight for racial equality or a trivial quest for equal time on a video game with your brother, sometimes voices are heard and sometimes they are not. BLM holds a grand fight, one which is by nature messy, unclear, and scary. The struggle for black equality in America is one which has been incessant and painfully gradual in its success. Increasingly clearly, political polarization is seeking to undermine this slow progress to racial equality, and damningly is being done by trying to delegitimize those who dare advocate it. BLM, an organization, is a voice of this progress. And the problem seems to be that their voice is finally being heard. My argument will clearly demonstrate that. Not only are the intentions of BLM paramount to the development of civil rights in America, but its methods too did not breach etiquette to an extent where BLM should be vilified and priored, let alone even questioned in this manner. Instead, this libel is rooted in a harsh desire to suppress minority voices. So, my colleague briefly spoke of the intentions. And so I would like to also just push specifically what the manifesto tells us about their intentions. Firstly, we've got healing justice. The manifesto explains this as the building of nurturing systems that support black communities impacted by oppressive structures. It's hard to find an issue with that. Then we've got policy, a world where black people have all that we need. This naturally includes food, education, housing, healthcare, access to clean water, etc. And lastly, per their manifesto, uplift black culture through arts. Now, these principles lay out clearly their key intentions and seem pretty inoffensive. The key differentiator is that they act as an anthem for African Americans that seeks not just to ask shyly for tolerance, as they have done for too long, but to loudly make clear an expectation for complete recognition, equality, and respect. These ideals, rooted in a sense of wanting to heal the past, as per their manifesto, do not seek to transgress what any human can expect: dignity, representation, and a voice. Acting to challenge these pursuits, therefore, in any way seems unsubstantiated and rooted in prejudice. So, we return to the debate with an understanding of the framing. We are asking if the methods were so disproportionate and so heinous that they undermine these undoubtedly noble goals that BLM hold. So, to examine a method that could be so evil that it undermines these noble causes, let's take the magnum opus, let's take the strongest piece of the anti-BLM playbook and address our floor speaker's point on vandalism, the 2020 George Floyd riots. This event was not just defining for America, but for the world. With 26 million protesters in America alone, and protests spread across 93 countries/territories, these riots define civil discourse as an opener to the new decade. So, while my opponent's personal experience as a cop is valuable, we must start on clear ground. 89% of these spontaneous protests were non-destructive, and 96% were non-violent. And this is collected by the Pew Research Center, who collated data about the protests across 2020. Of course, with BLM being the predominant chief body of these protests. Immediately, we are faced with the absurdity of painting BLM as a violent organization by extrapolating, literally in the face of statistical evidence, the destruction within the riots. Yet, that destruction was real. The fact that the majority of protests were peaceful does not rectify or excuse the real damages that were done. Take the oft-cited $1 to $2 billion of damages due to vandalism and arson in LA. But it must be universally understood these damages were in fact adversarial to BLM's intentions and do not constitute part of their protesting methods, explaining simultaneously why the majority of protests were peaceful and the contrasting senselessness of any violence that did occur. So let's take a journalist article by Syrian Sadar, who explains explicitly the damage these riots had on minority and family-owned businesses, revealing a complete lack of intelligent targeting, which we would expect if BLM were to, in some way, be responsible for these attacks. It would make much more sense that they targeted companies perhaps perceived as complicit or participatory in racial injustice across the globe. On top of this, the violent riots, too, were demonstrably condemned by BLM's Global Network Foundation, with multiple subsidiaries actively distancing themselves from violence and advocating peaceful protests. For example, a particularly strange character, Hawk Newsom, a radical speaker, created a brand called BLM New York, or BLM NY, naturally trying to draw a relationship to BLM as the official organization. He went viral for threatening bloodshed in front of Mayor-elect Eric Adams if a certain police unit, the plainclothes, was reinstated. In response, the BLM Global Network explicitly distanced themselves, making it clear that the organization does not ally with extremist ideologies, regardless of if they are in the name of black rights. So, these factors act to expose the detached nature of the violence we saw at the riots, and as a result, it becomes increasingly hard and arbitrary to attach these rogue acts of destruction to the name BLM. Instead, they are better defined as opportunistic and hedonistic attacks motivated by de-individuation and greed rather than enacting BLM's goals. De-individuation, for those not familiar, is a psychological concept laid out by social scientist Zimbardo, and it pervades protest culture and defines the escalation that we noted in 2020 and essentially every other large protest. Large groups feel a sense of anonymity, and this enables wrongdoers to behave in an unfiltered fashion. To reduce such a universal, commonplace psychological phenomena accepted in the field of psychology to a malign method used by one organization is completely baseless. De-individuated individuals have caused violence at every large-scale protest you could imagine, whether that's the Iraq War peace protest, largely commended as being one of the most peaceful large-scale protests of all time. There were still de-individuated rogue actors which were not in any way affiliated with or influenced by the Stop the War coalition, who led the Iraq protests, and in our case, BLM. So, instead, these people took the opportunity to act blamelessly and perpetrate violence and their own greed. Understanding the violence through established psychological theory, rather than right-wing rhetoric, which I will discuss shortly, appears a much more good-faith discussion of the 2020 riots, and clearly the attacks were not one incited or even complicitly accepted top-down. I may take it at the end. Why then? If BLM's methods did not even involve any incitement of destruction or violence, is their name slandered by these moments of uncivil barbarity? Well, this baseless rhetoric has been circulated in conservative spheres and has very much made it to the mainstream and made BLM completely synonymous with riots. Fox News, for example, reporting rioting and looting linked to George Floyd protests leaves a trail of destruction across American cities. Or Trump indicting BLM as a symbol of hate. Clearly, as these claims are wholly conflicting to the underground situation we have just discussed, we begin to see cracks in the conservative perspective and reveals it is fueled by a drive for traditionalism and subservience rather than a self-purported, dignified claim for public safety. So, briefly, just to bring this home back to the UK, as my colleague already did in much more detail than me, I want to make it clear BLM's baseless slander is one seen here too. For instance, the Daily Mail, however much you want to legitimize them, naturally they have significant reach, so I will comment on them anyway, reported misleadingly that BLM protesters had overcome police and were breaking into Downing Street. The Met corrected them, revealing Downing Street was secure, and the sensationalist media simply wanted to spur a spiteful story. Now, of course, I have just given you an anecdote, but I hope that my previous statistical and psychological insight demonstrate BLM is not by nature a dangerous organization and instead is victim to a large-scale smear campaign. One second. Submitting to this gross distortion of reality and challenging BLM's methods of protest acts as a right-wing misdirection to try and undermine their cause. So, let's be clear. BLM's methods are conceived on ideals of peace and unity. BLM is a decentralized movement which has seen thousands of protests since the 2020 riots, and there's a reason you probably haven't heard of them. they weren't a big enough event to make the news. And therefore, BLM's core methodology does not rely on pomp and grandeur, but on compassion and peace. Thank you, and please vote for the proposition.